Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some admiration for that member, but I know that he is really concerned about his mates, because when they've finished selling off the SOEs, he knows that Fonterra will be the next, and he knows he feels very uncomfortable about that. Mr. Speaker, there have been many words said about the budget, and I would use my own, Mr. Speaker, but I make reference to a well-known commentator, Jane Clifton. Her description of the budget is that, quote, Mr. Speaker, but a library might struggle to assign an ISBN. That's an international standard book number to it. Is it fact or is it fiction? Romance, even. She says there are so many variables around those figures. Mr. Speaker, that's a very good summary of what is basically a dishonest and unfair budget. Mr. Speaker, there is $4 billion, a $4 billion gap between what IRD say can be produced and between what Treasury say can be produced from this economy for government expenditure. Mr. Speaker, that is an irresponsible gap in my view, and none of the members on the other side of the House has attempted to get up and explain it. Even the Minister who's going to sell off power companies to build her prisons, Mr. Speaker, she could not explain that $4 billion gap. Mr. Speaker, is the budget fair, or does it make New Zealand a fairer place? Well, no on both counts. I came into this Parliament, as most of my colleagues have here, to try and make New Zealand a better and a fairer society, Mr. Speaker. This budget has failed. That government failed for the third time to make a fairer New Zealand. The first budget was the greatest inequity of all. It gave huge tax cuts to the people on the highest incomes, and it gave pittance to people on lower incomes, Mr. Speaker. And this budget continues down that unfair, inequitable, immoral path. That is, to give the money to the top and hope it trickles down to the people at the bottom. Mr. Speaker, they tried that. They tried that through the 90s. It does not work. It does not work around the world. And the reality is that this country is one of the worst countries in the OECD for disparities of wealth and inequality, Mr. Speaker. Those are the facts. Those are the facts. Let's see what this does, Mr. Speaker. There are many things said about it. But the key, the budget is based on the objective to sell state assets, because most of the initiatives in the budget depend upon, the Prime Minister says, on a mandate at the next election to sell down state assets. Well, Mr. Speaker, why would you do that? Why would you sell an asset that delivers a 15% return to pay down debt that you get for 4 or 5%? It is just dumb economics. The only reason they're doing it, Mr. Speaker, is to offer opportunities for their mates. Mark Weldon has a stock exchange that is almost a joke, because the major assets keep getting sold off to large overseas. Lion Nathan, one of the last. Lion Nathan, big player in Australia, on the Australian Stock Exchange, gone from New Zealand. One of the proud companies that this country developed, Mr. Speaker, and NZX continues to allow that sell-off of our assets, Mr. Speaker. Well, what we've got is the need for a fair and balanced capital market. But there are no toys to play with. So John Key, as a money trader, and the National Party, as the recipients of large amounts of corporate funding, have promised those people that we will deliver you an opportunity to buy blue-chip, gilt-edged state-owned assets. Oh yes, the member over there looks very uncomfortable, and so he should be, Mr. Speaker. So he should be, because he knows that is the truth, Mr. Speaker. So here we have assets owned by every mum and dad in this country. And John Key says, oh, we're going to sell them to mum and dad investors. Well, no, Mr. Speaker, we own them now. So who are they going to be sold to? Well, those who are lucky enough to have been the beneficiaries of the large tax cuts. They'll be able to afford the chairs, and then, Mr Speaker, they will do as they did with Contact. They will flick them off for a healthy profit to overseas investors. Sure as day follows night. That is what will happen, Mr Speaker, and that is why it is outrageous, Mr Speaker. The next thing, Mr Speaker, that the government intends to do to pay back its mates is to privatise ACC. We saw this in 1998, Mr Speaker, when the national government had to deliver to the people who were funding and supporting them. They said to the insurance companies, we'll deliver you a big chunk of a very big, healthy, profitable market in New Zealand. And that is the area of accident compensation. Mr Speaker, we have seen reports identifying time and time again that ACC is the best system, bar none, in the world for no-faults accident cover. The cheapest, half the rate of Australia, Mr Speaker, half the rate. I confess, Mr Speaker, our accident rate in the workplace is not right. And hopefully if the government had properly funded the Department of Labour, we would have had a few more mines inspectors, we would have had a few more working inspectors and saved lives up and down this country. Mr Speaker, the area of ACC and accident prevention needs some work. But it is the best system. It keeps lawyers and their grubby hands off litigation and companies, with all due respect to a couple of lawyers around, of course, but my colleague knows full well that offered the opportunity, lawyers will take it and get their grubby hands on all that money. And they will not deliver that to the people who have had accidents who need that cover. Mr Speaker, it is scandalous that we sit back. And New Zealanders might be apathetic, we might be comfortable, we might be a bit slack, but we're not stupid. And as I go around the workplaces in my electorate, Mr Speaker, they shake their heads at the idea that state-owned assets will be privatised, and they shake their heads about ACC being privatised because some of them, and I spoke to one the other day, had been covered by an accredited employer under the old scheme, under the 1998 initiatives, and had tried to get cover, Mr Speaker, and had had a hell of a battle, had been unable to get what he expected to get under the ACC system prior to 1998. Mr Speaker, if they think that's bad, just you wait, not you, Mr Speaker, just every New Zealander wait and see what happens if National ever get the opportunity to privatise ACC. Mr Speaker, the third thing that is of concern coming out of the budget, Mr Speaker, is the same criminal act, Mr Speaker, immoral act, Mr Speaker, that Robert Muldoon committed on superannuation savings in the 1970s. That is that he destroyed growing confidence in superannuation and in savings across New Zealand. And the thing is, Mr Speaker, while the changes are portrayed as being rather minor, they undermine the confidence, and I've met people old and young right across the West Coast Tasman electorate and elsewhere who are sick and tired of the government playing around with superannuation. And this latest move on KiwiSaver, Mr Speaker, has ripped the confidence from those people who were just starting to believe in saving for their future, Mr Speaker. It's not rubbish. And those members, if they got off their chuffs and went out and spoke to real people, Mr Speaker, instead of having the corporates come in, they would hear those messages too, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this is an unfair budget. It continues on with the philosophy and the policy that the national government will look after its wealthy mates, Mr Speaker, and squeeze every other poor New Zealander who doesn't have many options, Mr Speaker. 170,000 jobs in the budget. Mr Speaker, a $4 billion gap in revenue projections, Mr Speaker. That is the fiction that this House was delivered with the last budget, Mr Speaker. We have said we will not sell state assets, Mr Speaker. We have said we will renationalise ACC, and let that be a warning for all the private companies that are sniffing around now, Mr Speaker. And we have said the first $100 of your income will be tax-free, and we have said that GST on fruit and vegetables will come off, because we understand the pressure on the average working family in this country, Mr Speaker, and it's about time a government, a Labor government, gave those people a fair go. This budget was outrageous. It entrenches the privilege and the position of the wealthy in this country, Mr Speaker, at the expense of all the others.